Let's have a look at how you can use the render tool in the 3D tiny house designer. The render tool is useful if you want to create realistic images for your client to be able to show them how the tiny house is going to look like realistically before building it. This usually helps to help the client understand what the tiny house will actually look like, because it is more realistic and closer to life rather than just a 3D model. If we look at the render tool, it is located up here on the top right, and it will bring up the very basic render settings. To change the render settings, you can simply change the height of the sun and the rotation of the sun. The height of the sun will determine the time of day, and the rotation of the sun will simply determine where the sun comes from and where the shadows will go. When you are creating a shot, it's important to think about the setting of the shot. In this case, if you're taking an exterior image, it's usually quite good to have a high sun angle with the sun coming from the back of the camera. The camera is always located from where you are looking at. So at this moment, I'm looking at the tiny house from the front left, because the drawbar is here. And that means I can then rotate the sun in the right angle. So I know the drawbar is here. If you look at this little graphic here, you can see the drawbar too. Then I will go and take the sun over here, which is roughly the same direction of where the sun is coming from. And now, to take the render, I will click on Render Now. There we go. And this will now send a request to the render server. If you would be rendering with a regular render tool, you would usually be building a 3D model that you can then import into the render tool first. Building that 3D model would usually take many hours, and then creating a scene in the render tool and creating the right settings also takes many hours on top of that. Also, rendering in a render tool usually requires you to have a really good PC, but the 3D Tiny House Designer renders your image on the server, meaning you don't have to have a good PC in order to be able to render the render for you. So now that the render is in the pipeline, it has taken just a couple of seconds to process, and now it's back here, so the render has just been completed. So we can have a look at that now. So it's just downloaded, and I'll just quickly open it in my downloads. There you go. So this is what the render tool has created for you. The render tool places the tiny house into a realistic scene, so it looks like it is in a forested area with a nice parking spot that the tiny house is located at. And the sun, of course, in this case is coming from the back, and it's quite a high sun angle, so it's in the middle of the day, so the shadows are quite small. Of course, you can also render the image from the interior of the tiny house rather than only rendering from the exterior. To show you how that looks like, I will quickly switch back into the 3D Tiny House Designer. To create a shot from the interior, I will first switch my camera over to the walkthrough camera. And now I can move the camera like I am moving around as a person. So your camera is now on the head of the person, if that makes sense, and then you can use your WASD keys or your arrow keys to move around. And I'm just going to place my camera in a centered shot like this here, and I will want to make sure that I'm inside of the tiny house. So the render tool automatically detects when you are within the tiny house, and then it creates an interior scene, meaning it will create some interior lighting for you. There we go. So I'm just going to stay somewhere around here. And a good trick is when you are creating interior shots is that your head is always on head level, because if you think about it, it's unrealistic that your image will come from the bottom, or if your image will come unnaturally from the top like this. So the client or the person looking at the picture will have an easier time understanding what the tiny house looks like with its proportions. Now that I've taken the angle where I want to take the picture from, I will quickly change the settings. A good tip when you're taking interior shots is to angle the sun a little bit lower. This will make sure that the sun actually streams into the inside of the tiny house, so it looks a little bit more inviting. So the angle is still coming from the right spot, so it's coming from behind the camera into the tiny house, so it will hopefully fall over the island and the kitchen in the background. So I'll just quickly press render now, and we'll wait a couple of seconds until that is done. There we go. So the render has just been completed, and you can see the sun coming in from the right behind the camera, and you can see the textures of the oak of the cabinets and the white of the interior as well. If you're wondering where you can receive your render, I will quickly show you what it looks like when you get a render. So I'll just quickly use the render button here one more time, which now renders my image. And now we can see this render submitted notification come up. So this says that the render has been submitted to the server and it is now processing. Now it will take maybe a minute or something like that until the render is processed, and we will get another pop-up. This will come up here as well. So we'll just quickly wait for that. There we go. So the render has now been completed, and to download the image, we just simply need to click on this notification. I'm currently in full screen, so I'll just disable my full screen and you will see the render pop up here in the downloads. And there we go. This is the render now here, and we now have it in our downloads folder, and we can start editing it further from now there. Now that we're back in the 3D Tiny House Designer, I want to show you a couple more tips of placing your camera well so you can create beautiful shots. So what I was saying before, a good idea is always to keep your tiny house shot centered and at head level. So if you are taking a shot, for example, from in the bathroom, it would always make sense to have your camera pointing somewhere at head level, and then maybe angle your camera down a little bit so you can take more in of the space. Otherwise, sometimes it also makes sense to have a shot from a higher level, so you can actually look down at the area that you are looking at, so you can actually understand what the space is doing. So that is a good idea when you are taking interior shots. When you are doing exterior shots, it's always a good idea to also go back to eye level and place the camera so you have most of the tiny house in focus, and you still have a little bit of breathing room around the tiny house. If you're that close to the tiny house, the shot will not be very pleasant, and if you're very far away from the tiny house, it's really going to be hard to see where the tiny house is located. So basically that applies to all 4 shots from the side, so you can kind of go to the corners of the tiny house, and most of the time that will create quite a nice shot. Otherwise, you can also center your tiny house on the sides like this, so you can create a nice symmetrical shot to highlight the feature of the tiny house exterior. And always make sure to rotate the sun with you so you can have the sun coming from the right angle. Otherwise, you might have a lot of shadows in the foreground and a lot of sun in the background, which doesn't always work really well. So there you go. That's how the render tool works. Another cool thing that you can do with the render tool is you can actually show the tiny house cut open from the exterior. So I can disable the wall like this, and I can, let's say, go down and look down like this here from the top. Of course, this is not really realistic, and you wouldn't ever really see a tiny house from that angle, and it will never be cut open, but it can create quite a cool effect. So I'm just going to angle my sun again from the right side, and I might have it a little bit lower like this, then the last exterior shot, and then I'll click render again. There you go. So the render is now back again, and this is what it looks like. One tip: when you have received the render, you can actually post-process the render as well. You don't just have to take the image the way that you have received it, but you can add some color grading, you can crop the image as well. A good external tool to use for that is Photoshop, and I can show you some basic processing on how you can make a render pop a little bit more. Alright, now we're in Photoshop. To show you some very basic editing tips in Photoshop, you can quickly apply some brightness and contrast to this picture. Of course, you don't have to use Photoshop. There's other image editing tools which will be able to do the same thing, but this is my tool of choice. So what I will do now here is I will just quickly turn up the contrast a little bit, which just simply makes the image pop a little bit more. One thing that we'll see here at the moment is that the tiny house is quite bright, and we want to bring that brightness down a little bit. So we'll go into brightness and contrast again here, and this has created a layer mask for me. So I'll quickly inverse the layer mask, meaning that currently this is not doing anything for me at the moment, and I will just simply turn down the brightness on this layer mask. And now I have a brush with a white stencil, so wherever I draw, it will now bring down the brightness. So there we go. Now what we will see is that the tiny house is getting a little bit darker, and the very light colors of the cladding are not as apparent anymore. So now if we look at before and after, like that, we have a very bright tiny house, and the surrounding area is a little bit dull, and now we can turn it on again, and now it is a little bit more grounded.